Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of Insight. In Insight today, two major developments of the day, one around NSG and of course the one big development is around the Brexit. Well, it's a historic day. Britain has voted to leave the European Union and has put to rest a question that's been rumbling close to the surface of British politics for a generation. That is, the country should remain within the EU or move out and go it alone. The supporters of the Brexit are now calling it their Independence Day, but there's a lot in store for the UK and the world at large. UK will not leave immediately. It will still be a member of the European Union at this stage. However, the process of leaving will begin. The verdict is out. Britain has voted to leave the European Union in a historic referendum, a decision that is ought to give the biggest blow to the European project of greater unity since World War II. The vote instantly creates the biggest global financial shock since the 2008 economic crisis, this time with interest rates around the world already at or near zero, stripping policymakers of the means to fight it. The pound suffered its biggest one-day fall in history, plunging more than 10% against the dollar to hit levels last seen in 1985. The vote will now initiate at least 2 years of messy divorce proceedings with the European Union and cast doubt on London's future as a global financial capital. The future of Prime Minister David Cameron, who gambled the fate of the nation on an outcome he predicted would be catastrophic, remains doubtful. Bureau Report. Well, Mr. David Cameron is now under pressure to resign as Prime Minister. Mr. Cameron had said during the campaign that in the event of a leave vote, he would activate Article 50 of the 2009 Lisbon Treaty without undue delay, setting in motion the process of withdrawing from the European Union. Well, once Article 50 is triggered, there's no way back into the EU unless by unanimous consent from all member states. But quitting the EU is not an automatic process. It has to be negotiated with the remaining members. These negotiations are meant to be completed within the next 2 years, but the European Parliament has a veto over any new agreement formalizing the relationship between the EU and the UK. So what is going to be the larger impact of the Brexit victory on Britain, the EU, its members and the world? Well, to talk more on this, I'm joined by Dr. Sriram Cholia from the Jindal School of International Studies, and I'm also joined by Mr. Sanjay Kapoor, editor, Hard News. Welcome to the program. I'd like to start the discussion with you, Mr. Cholia. How do you look at this verdict? Was it something on the expected lines or not?
It's a political earthquake. It's completely shaken up all the assumptions and the fundamentals and the structures that underpinned European order. Because until now, the European integration process has been going in one direction, which is adding more and more members. Now there are 28. If Britain leaves, it's going to, for the first time, go backwards, which is 27. And there could be a domino effect with some other countries with more Eurosceptic parties rising, also demanding referendums and to pull out. So I think it's in a way the biggest blow to the European project if you go back in history since the 1950s, when they first started the coal and steel community, then the European Economic Community. Britain joined in the 70s, and now it looks like it has reached some kind of saturation point. It's not able to convince a lot of people on the grassroots for a variety of reasons. Social, cultural issues with immigration, as well as economic, distribution of the benefits of integration. This whole liberal integration project has been imperiled. And what the vote today shows is that no matter how good these ideas are, single market, single currency. Of course, Britain was not even part of the single currency.
That's right.
But it was part of the
the
common
single
market.
That's right.
Then borderless trade, movement of people, all these basic assumptions. Even identity was supposed to have become more cosmopolitan. Younger people, even Britain, mind you, almost 48% or more voted to remain.
That's right.
So for a lot of them, it's I think a big shock to know that they are actually in the minority now. And that means that even the European Parliament, which has got more and more Eurosceptic parties getting MPs elected, it's now set up for an implosion unless the European elites led by Germany and France take corrective measures and reconnect to the grassroots, because what has happened is there's a big disconnect.
So
and
has the verdict, we'll delve a little deeper into it, but has this verdict really taken the world by surprise at this point in time? Because many people were saying that Britain is indeed not going to quit the EU, considering these economic factors.
I think it was grossly misread, primarily because, as is the tendency of many pollsters and also the opinion makers, they were spending more time in London. And if you look at the voting pattern, London has both a hand, the feet, and feet to remain in the European Union. Yeah. So surely a lot of people went wrong, and even the financial capital was supporting the EU project, and Britain is staying there. But surely these entire assumptions were wrong, because whatever may be the gains of staying in European Union, those facts and figures do not really convince a large mass of people who think that they were being hurt by the loss of sovereignty, and to some extent even undue advantages that come to members of the EU. I mean, especially on the issue of immigration. People thought they were losing jobs, and England had no business to be spending about $9 billion in keeping the EU afloat. The commensurate benefits that should be coming to the ordinary people in Great Britain were not being felt. So I think there was a clear mismatch in what was expected by the so-called elite, which thought that the EU was a very humane project and England should be part of it. But a large mass of people, I think, were totally disgruntled. They thought that there was no reason to be there. There was a loss of sovereignty that they were experiencing. They thought that you had a technocracy which was being ruled from, which was running from Brussels, which was taking away the freedom of people, and a lot of things that they could do on their own. And surely they wanted some kind of reclaiming that the flavor, the strength, and the memories of Great Britain as a state which used to run the world in a certain way.
Right.
So all these facts, all these things, quite to some extent, weighed on the minds of ordinary voters, and that is what the outcome you see. And if you look at the pattern of voting, you will find the entire countryside, small town, many areas voting for getting out of
That's
the
right. And
European
there were
Union.
huge voter turnout.
And there was a huge voter turnout. So
True.
there is I think what has really happened, that you have a division right in the middle. You have the young university educated who are all for EU, and on the other hand you have the other lot, who the aging population who don't like being there.
Right.
So I don't know how that reconciliation is going to take place. On top of that, you have Scotland, which wants to remain in EU.
And it was indeed a very close fight, I would say, because
very close, right down to the wire, as
that's
they
right.
say.
It's 51.9% and 48.1%. I mean, 51.9 for the Leave Club, and the Remain Club almost at 40.
But in a certain, I would say that it shows a diminishing and devaluation of a kind of politics that ran Great Britain for a while. You have the Labour, which lost very badly in the last election, continue to lose support. And then you have the UK Independent Party, whose numbers have been growing. If you heard the leader, Nigel Farage, he's called it the Independence Day.
That's true.
And he was saying that this is a moment we were waiting for all these years. And
you
suddenly
see, all those arguments, from sovereignty to immigration issues to a lot of other issues like the EU courts, their intervention into human rights and other aspects, all that, of course, triggering the sovereignty part. Has it really surpassed all the other issues? I mean, there are people, even Indian commentators, who have said that sitting in Mumbai, the picture was entirely different from what it was, let's say, inside Britain. Well, how do you read it, Dr. Sholia? Is it more about the sovereignty aspect, the fact that one of their leaders calls it the Independence Day?
I think there are deeper factors. For example, Britain has been declared as out of economic crisis, but it hasn't really the benefits of the rebound have not percolated across the society. So although David Cameron won a re-election last year in the general election, there is still a great sense of resentment at these outsiders, quote unquote migrants, who are coming and stealing our jobs and so on. So that factor was critical, and linked to that is a kind of racism and kind of a xenophobia, which, even though Britain has had a multicultural ethos, has come back in a big way since the economic crisis began a few years ago. So that factor is there. It's like a backdrop factor. And then there is, of course, the continental politics. In the continental Europe itself, as I said, the Eurosceptic parties have been rising. So there's like the UK Independence Party and the other far right parties in Britain which voted for this, which campaigned for the Brexit, drew solace from the fact that this is now becoming widespread, and they even supported each other.
Yeah.
So these kind of factors were, I think, also there. But at the end of the day, it's about tugging at people's emotions and playing the identity card. Sometimes if the timing is right, like a country that is recovering from crisis, fascist or semi-fascist tendencies can come up, and that's what we are seeing. I mean, Nigel Farage is for me a soft fascist. Essentially what they are saying is, all brown people, all black people are evil and criminals and terrorists, and we need to keep them out. So it's a bit of, so the Trump kind of ideology, if it is working even in Europe, it
so
has to do with.
You see a pattern here?
It's a I think a crisis of Western liberalism overall, because be it North America or Europe, there is a failure of the liberal elites. They thought that we are always right. They thought that there was a degree of smugness on their part that we are doing the right things, breaking down the borders, and we are creating trade and free movement of labor and all these things. And they always try to argue that this is good for the people. But the people have not been convinced. So clearly there is a big disjuncture between the elite level discourse and the mood on the street. And I think even the turnout was high at 70%, but I think the turnout in favor of the Remain group was lower, obviously.
Yeah.
So they didn't make a big effort to to bring people out on the streets as much as the older voters who tend to be anyway politicized. So the youngsters, I think they stayed back thinking we are anyway going to win because the betting agencies are saying that we will remain.
True.
So I think even at the level of mobilization, there was huge mistakes made.
But you see, was it, Sanjay Kapoor, a mix of both these factors, both economic in nature and this factor of nationalism, something which has been mooted now, that probably this is something which is driving countries now towards a different track, which they had not followed in all these years. And, many people are connecting it with the rise of Trump in the US.
Let's face it, as Professor Cholia is saying, that, the world has gone through a major, you can say, churning. It's been destabilized after 2008 economic meltdown, and it has not recovered at all. I mean, you look at what Europe has become.
2008 was a turning point, basically.
Yeah, you look at what has happened in Europe. You look at what has happened in Greece. Even European Union as a project looks very, very weak in after their inability to handle Greece and the suffering it has caused. About 25-30% of the people have left the country. They don't know where it is going, even though European Bank has tried to, ECB, European Central Bank has tried to stabilize that. So the faith in the ability of the European technocracy as well as the European Bank to find solution to the problem of ordinary people has not been found. And that is why, people don't think that it has the ability to transform their lives. So they think that if their respective national governments can take their command of their own destiny, things might really change. And that mood is sweeping everywhere. I mean, coupled by xenophobia, coupled by Islamophobia, caused by the free movement of people, especially the migrant crisis, refugees coming. So all kinds of incendiary things are taking place there. It's a very, very noisy and explosive mix of things, which the mood from Europe right up to United States of America, the same kind of mood is prevailing. And different countries and different people are reacting in a similar way. They do not trust the liberal promise of creating a society which is large-hearted. They think being large-hearted actually causes some kind of economic distress to ordinary lives, people who may not be educated, who may not be, you can say, mobile in a sense, because they have to strive, jostle for space with migrants who come from different societies. So, it is born more out of insecurity, and as I said in the past, also by memory of greatness. They want to revisit some of the glorious past, especially the older generation. They would always say, oh, in the good old days, something like this would never happen. So, if you recall, Prime Minister Cameron has been talking about cutting down the number of migrants who are going to come in from hundreds of thousands to just few thousand. So even when he was trying to negotiate with the European Union, he said 300,000 odd people came last time, we'll bring it down to 30 or 10. So he was trying to reach out to those people who thought that the problems of Europe, of England, or Great Britain is primarily driven by the migrants coming in from there. Especially they talk about the Polish plumber who's supposed to be taking away low-end jobs. So I think that this is not going to be a solution to what has happened, because this is, I think, a beginning of many of the problems.
What is it really going to trigger now? What happens to the EU is very important to look out for. Is there going to be further disintegration? Would the onus be now only on Germany? Or what if Germany, decides the other way tomorrow?
They will have to arrest the downslide, they will need to take drastic measures. They have to be much more liberal. Angela Merkel was catering more to domestic German electorate rather than the larger interests of the European region during the Eurozone crisis. Even with migration, she adopted a liberal stance, but it has backfired. So with the refugee crisis, so I think she will have to. I think now the time for talking is over. They need to actually reach out and connect to the grassroots again in a big way. Secondly, they have put countries like Hungary and Poland under notice, because these have become extreme far right ruled countries already, and clearly democracy itself is in threat in these countries. So it's like the former Soviet space is the most vulnerable now, because they have not had a long tradition of Western liberalism anyway. They've come out of authoritarian regimes for decades, and it's only 20 years, and not all of them have moved positively towards democratization. So there could be actually a kind of a reversal of democracy itself with the rise of these fascistic kind of tendencies. So I think for the Europeans, it's a big wake-up call, and they will need to also open the purse strings more. They've been very stingy, with the austerity and all these things. So all those have backfired now. Of course, Britain was not as affected by these policies, because it was not as badly hit as these pigs economies, as they were called, Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain.
Right.
But nonetheless, Italy is very vulnerable, because it is perennially broken politics and very poor economic performance. So there are some who are arguing that Italy may go next. So the question is, of course, people overreact after an incident, and maybe it will stabilize. So, but they will be hoping it doesn't go down from 27 anymore, because it's so ironic that they are not willing to admit Turkey, which has wanted to come in, and here you are, countries that are already members saying, sorry, I better walk out. So I think they have to recalculate. They may have to actually bring in some of these right-wing elements and absorb them into the system.
So would the world as a whole will have to approach again towards the issue of international cooperation, because EU was indeed a concept in that.
There is a very good chance that as this slide increases, that some of these old antagonisms which had for centuries brought war and misery to Europe could also resurface, because some of these populist demagogues like Viktor Orban of Hungary, for example, the president, they are not at all interested in compromise with anybody else. During the migrant crisis, we already saw that the EU was split down the middle. So what we are seeing is it will have serious economic impact as well, because if trade within the bloc now falls and they have to renegotiate all these things, tariff rates and all this, it's going to also cut down on the prosperity prospect. So both in terms
prosperity of the region and these countries in particular.
Shared prosperity, the idea that we'll all together and we'll benefit together, that's in peril now.
That's in peril. Well, how do you look at that? The whole idea of EU disintegrating and the concept of international cooperation.
Yeah, I think all that comes under enormous stress, and to some extent, countries like Switzerland, which had put their membership on hold from 1994, when they realized that Great Britain might exit, they decided to go through and announce that they don't want to be members of EU. And this is something that might inspire other countries, because they think that if this prosperity Switzerland is enjoying by staying away or having only a peripheral membership, or a membership of EU, can enjoy it, surely they can also attempt, because I said earlier, the faith on the European Central Bank has gone, because what it really does is to take away the sovereignty of individual countries. If Greece had control over their central bank, they would have devalued their respective currency, but the euro doesn't allow that kind of tinkering with the valuation. So those kind of thoughts might come to many societies which think that they could, especially politicians, the Hungarian prime minister that he's referring to. Similarly, Austria also came very close to having somebody from the extreme right. It was only postal ballots which allowed that him to be kept away. But that matter is a different, we can talk about it later. But all those factors could cause a certain amount of anxiety all around about whether countries, like for example, there was one Hungarian MP which is talking about referendum. There are more such demands that are going to come out. And because it creates space for a kind of politics which was getting delegitimized. And in the European project was a very liberal, humane project which provided accommodation. All that came under severe stress because of slowdown, because of the migrant crisis, because of many other things. And despite the fact that you have President Obama who said that if England gets out, we are not going to deal with them and put them right at the end of the queue, those things haven't really lessened the ardor of people who wanted to get out of EU, which is saying a lot.
And since it has happened now with one of the countries, there is a precedent. So others, of course, now, until now, of course, there was no other country which has done that in the past. But what happens next with, of course, the fact that the US had said it in the past too, that there is going to be, in fact, an impact on the economic ties, the trade ties of all these nations, and US in particular, with the UK. So how does that happen now?
Well, the special relationship will survive in a way. In fact, because of the special relationship across the Atlantic, the British have always felt that they are not really part of continental Europe. They didn't adopt the euro. If you go back in time historically also, even from the time of the Christian Reformation, when Henry VIII broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, Britain broke away with the Anglican Church away from the main continent. So they've had those traditions, and those are now coming to the fore. But I think, the US-Britain relationship will survive, of course. But what it means is that I think essentially the Americans will not be able to leverage Britain's role within the EU system. Because earlier, Britain was like the, voice of the Americans in the EU system, mostly promoting kind of liberal free market, especially under Cameron, because conservatives have been ruling for some time now, and even under Tony Blair they had moved to the free market kind of stuff. So now that voice is going to be missing, and the Germans are going to miss it the most, because France is very statist, Italy is completely dysfunctional, broken, Spain is on its knees. So what we are seeing now is like there's going to be no Britain for balancing out these multiple ideologies, and it simply means that right is going to be on the ascendant, right, kind of like a populist right, which is not necessarily going to promote the cooperation, the idea of cooperation. So conflict and instability are on the cards.
Okay, but what happens to India? India has got its own stakes now in the in the region, and especially in the UK.
I think Prime Minister Narendra Modi reached out to Indians to support, the Prime Minister Cameron's appeal that should remain with the EU. But surely, there was a different mood that was prevailing. So all kinds of voice of sanity didn't really work, whether it was Obama, with this Modi and many others, or even European leaders. So with India is concerned, we have 800 companies which do business. They've got a few lakh people who work there. You can look at the stock market is getting hammered. Almost 1,000 points have come down.
Yeah.
So what will really happen is that we have old ties with Great Britain. We've been with them for many years. But if they actually go away, new deals will have to be negotiated. A lot of new interests have to be looked after. So it is not going to be a very ideal situation if you look at it. And that is why there is uncertainty, because I don't think anybody anticipated that it's going to be so, almost like an earthquake, as they keep talking about.
That's right. Yeah. So that's going to be one major concern, and the fact that many of our people work in the UK. So what about the jobs and other related concerns?
So the work permits are going to be, especially about the European citizens, their entire nature is going to change. They will have to come in with work permits. They will not be recognized. Earlier you had free movement. They also benefited from getting education in Europe, British universities. That in a certain way also goes away. So I was listening to one of the ministers. They would be allowed to there, but the relationship would have to be renegotiated.
But there could be one ironic outcome for India and China, because Cameron has been trying to woo these two big Asian giants for investment and so on. And now if City of London is broken away from Frankfurt, for example, which are the two big financial centers in Europe, then it's possible that actually they may depend more on Asian powers to bail them out. And to some extent, the Leave campaign was saying, we can always go, we have our own independent ties with the rest of the world, and we don't have to worry, we don't have to depend on these, Europeans anymore. So, they may be forced to actually do trade agreements and preferential agreements with China and India on more preferential basis for us. So ironically, Europe's and UK's loss could be a gain for us, but hardly in the larger scheme of things, it's not a great. They are British and Europeans are net losers.
How long will Britain have to survive the setback of this exercise economically?
Well, it has a financial industry that's quite vibrant and is connected globally, and it's mostly service driven. And they do host a large number of multinational corporations. But now MNCs will think about taxation, repatriation of profits on all these points, whether it is useful to headquarter in Britain or somewhere like Cologne or in Frankfurt, So they will need to think about these things, and it may, the worst fears are of a complete exodus of capital and a complete collapse of the pound sterling. That probably may not happen, because Britain is still probably in nominal GDP terms the 5th or 6th biggest in the world, and I think it will survive. But the point is, as Roger Cohen was saying on the New York Times, it is going to survive like an insular, isolated minnow. It had voice, it had some kind of stature within the EU, but now they've hacked, the voter electorate has hacked at its own feet. So instead of it becoming great again, what's going to happen is it's going to become little.
And what happens?
I wanted to add to what Dr. Cholaya was saying is about China. If you recall, when China was scouting for support for the AIIB, Asian Investment Bank, despite the pressure that was brought on Great Britain, they decided to become part of it. So there is some kind of a visible engagement which is there, with China, and Chinese media to some extent anticipated that they would be getting out. In a certain way, compared to many others, they were more prescient than the mainstream or the Western media.
So that's an interesting thing to, in fact, analyze. But what about the politics in Britain? I mean, what really happens to David Cameron? Would he have to really step down? Though he said during a campaign that he wouldn't do that.
I think his continuance has become untenable. As it is, he's facing quite a bit of heat. In fact, his entire campaign for remaining in European Union got undermined because of his name, his father's name coming up in Panama Papers. So he was, he had his back against the wall despite the concessions he was able to bring in from EU. So there would be, I think, great amount of churning in his own party, although he managed to lead the party to quite a sensational victory last year, which showed that the support of Labour Party is coming down, even not only in rest of Great Britain but also in Scotland. So I think we are going to look for a serious change. I was listening to Jeremy Corbyn as I was coming in here, and Jeremy Corbyn also is at a loose end. I mean, he's talking also about changing his politics, giving something to the people what they have been aspiring for, and he thought that the outcome of the results are primarily because ordinary people's life has been badly impacted. So they are all trying to figure out how to reach out, how to retain their constituencies, how to ensure that Scotland, which wants to be with EU, doesn't get out. So what we will see in the coming days is probably more referendums.
Well, Dr. Cholaya?
I think Cameron's blunder was in being complacent. When he first announced the referendum in 2013, he thought he could just, ward off a challenge of a faction within his party by just throwing a sop at them. And he was, at that time, the Eurosceptic and anti-Euro forces were not as strong as they became in 3 years. They built up, steadily. So I think he thought he could just get away with it and, continue leading the party and the country. But I think this is, in fact, the problem of Cameron is multiplied across the European elites, All of them thought they were pretty smug and complacent. Even until this morning, most of them were betting that the Remain side will win.
But you see, Joe Cox's murder, in fact, the sentiment that it had highlighted at that point of time, which the world witnessed, probably was something that nobody could have missed. And it was actually after that incident that, the reports clearly suggested that there is indeed a balance between the two groups.
It wasn't a lasting effect, actually.
We were all expecting that after Joe Cox's murder, there would be a certain realization that you're getting the fascist, violent forces, you're unleashing them, the atavistic forces.
But that didn't really happen.
Yeah, and I think the most sane, moderate, liberal voices will prevail over these forces. But as Dr. Cholaya has said, that didn't have an enduring impact.
It's not going to happen like that. Britain, there is a procedure which has to be followed for
It will be a number of years.
2 years,
step by step.
2 years.
2 years is being.
Yeah, but some of the trading arrangements and all those to unwind them will take a long time. And even in fact, the immigrants will keep coming in, by the way, until there is a formal separation.
And the relationship between EU and Britain? What about that?
Well, I think they will have to renegotiate everything. I mean, it's some people have said we are going to go to the Norway model. Norway is not a member of the EU, but gets some benefits out of it, access to the common market, but doesn't have the migration and all those things. So, I think Britain, in a way, if Boris Johnson or somebody now takes over, or James Gove, one of these conservative leaders within the Tory party who was for Brexit, they are going to push for a quicker separation to consolidate their own power and to win the next general election on their terms. So I think, and the Europeans are also going to be quick. They are not going to delay this, because the more this is in limbo, the less likely, the likelier that other vociferous tendencies will break out.
Okay, fine. So there's a lot which has to happen now following this verdict by the Britishers. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me. We'll take a very quick break now in Insight, and after the break, we'll look at another important development, which is around India's membership of the NSG. After the break. Welcome back. In Insight Now, discussion on the NSG issue. Well, as anticipated, China remained the one major obstacle in India's NSG bid. Thursday's meeting in Seoul remained inconclusive of India's membership of the nuclear trading bloc, though it was not only China but countries like Ireland, Austria, Brazil and Turkey, along with Switzerland now, as reports suggest, who have expressed their reservations on India's entry in the nuclear supplies group. Thursday's NSG meeting in Seoul has ended in a deadlock over India's membership, largely because of China's adamancy on the issue. China has remained stiff on the matter, saying that India's inclusion in NSG goes hand in hand with its signing the NPT. Reports suggest that along with China, Brazil, Austria and Ireland also raised questions on how a non-NPT nation can become part of the nuclear suppliers group. This despite Prime Minister Narendra Modi urging Chinese President Xi Jinping to support India's bid for membership to the NSG during their meeting in Tashkent on the sidelines of the SCO summit. India has been campaigning for membership of the NSG for the last few years and had formally moved its application last month. Though India tried its level best to bring China on board by opening as many diplomatic channels as possible. Prime Minister Modi's previous international visits, along with his recent five-nation tour to countries like Mexico and Switzerland, were largely aimed at garnering support for India's NSG bid. For now, the deadlock continues, and it remains to be seen if India can realize its NSG aspiration anytime soon. Bureau Report. And Prime Minister Modi had earlier called for a fair and objective assessment of India's bid when he met Chinese President Xi Jinping. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, on the sidelines of a multilateral summit in Tashkent, he had urged upon this issue. And China is not ready to budge at this point of time. But is it really the end of the road for India? That's something one will certainly have to analyze. To talk more on this, I'm joined by Commodore Uday Bhaskar from the Society for Policy Studies. He's a strategic affairs analyst. I'm also joined by Mr. Sanjay Kapoor from the Heart News. Well, Commodore Bhaskar, how do you look at the developments on the NSG? Was it very much on the expected lines?
Well, I would say that yes, it is disappointing, but it's not surprising, meaning that for the last few days, we could see a certain hardening of the position from Beijing, where they were repeatedly drawing attention to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and making that a condition, saying that non-signatories to the NPT cannot be considered for membership to the NSG, knowing fully well that it's an untenable condition, meaning that India has already conveyed its inability to be part of the NPT. And after May 1998, when India acquired the nuclear weapon capability, the whole frame of reference is no longer valid, meaning that the NPT as it stands today, if you look at the fine print, cannot accommodate India in its current profile as a state that has nuclear weapons. So China is aware of this, and yet they have made this a condition, knowing fully well that it cannot be in any way applied to India. So you can see very clearly.
Is it just because of the NPT or are there other issues, sir?
Well, they are identifying this as the main reason, and they have also been able to get the support of other nations. And some of the other nations are a bit of a surprise, such as Switzerland, for instance, which had earlier indicated that they would support India's entry. I think, Shalini, I would interpret this as a case of very, very cynical realpolitik at play. Prime Minister Modi was in Tashkent. He had spoken to the Chinese president, and we can see from the reports that have come out that he had urged the Chinese leader, Mr. Xi Jinping, to look at the whole issue in a fair and objective manner. Clearly, that has not been done, and China has repeatedly tried to draw Pakistan also into the frame of reference, and that is something which goes against what you might call as the normative goal of the NSG, which is the ability to regulate nuclear proliferation. When Pakistan, and it's absolutely amazing that there's been no official reference to the AQ Khan network. In all the run-up to the deliberations, not a single country has actually drawn attention to the fact that Pakistan has AQ Khan as part of its inheritance, and then of course the linkages to terrorism. So China is playing not only hardball, but I would say a very, very cynical approach to this entire question of the strategic stability, not just in South Asia, not India, Pakistan, but the entire Asian region, because you have North Korea on one side, Pakistan on the other, and China clearly is the source which has allowed a certain pattern of proliferation. So against this backdrop, I think one outcome of this entire series of events is that I think China has been smoked out. Now we know what China stands for in terms of the global grid, and that is something I think the entire nuclear suppliers group would also have to internalize, saying what next?
What next? Absolutely. But is this really going to be the end of the road for India?
I don't think so. You know, as we were talking, I was just trying to go through the statement which has been issued by the Nuclear Suppliers Group and also India's, position on this. I think it's what has come through is that our attempt to get into the group may have been stalled as of now, but there would be discussion, there would be engagement with other countries that want to, like India, to get into it. So I think the doors haven't been closed as yet, because primarily what happened, what China did, is to bring in the issue of criteria about the basic fundamentals of the nuclear suppliers group, the imperative of countries joining the non-proliferation treaty. So as an Indian, as a national, it might rankle that we have been kept out, but China was not the only one. I mean, if you look at it, you had the Switzerland, you had Brazil, you had many others. So Commander Bhaskar is holding China responsible. Surely they had an interest in trying to stop us, because they don't want another regional power in the neighborhood and basically a neighbor rising, because they know that India's profile is going to increase. But they were able to garner a great amount of support, because as I keep repeating to many of my friends, that China of 2008 is not the same as China of 2016. In 2008, you had George W. Bush, who was backing India entirely, and layer by layer, the entire opposition was cleared, and China was forced to back us. You know, you have a different kind of US, which is no longer the power that was in 2008, and I don't think they have the influence over many countries to
But you know, many people called China's daily statements on NSG, on India's NSG entry, as a sign of, and took it as a sign of nervousness in China. Well, was there something like that? Because they had took up the issue of Pakistan. At the end, in fact, they had said that the doors are open for discussion. After that, the Chinese president met the Indian prime minister, where a fair choice.
No, as I said earlier, Chinese had to reckon with the fact that they would not have allowed India to get into a group which would raise its profile. But they did it cleverly. I mean, as Commodore is saying, that they played hardball. They built up support amongst many European countries. Austria, take for example Switzerland. The Prime Minister Modi went to Switzerland, and in a matter of 48 hours, they changed their stance, because they started talking about processes and they started talking about other things. And similarly, other countries. So there were misgivings, and they tried to show that it was a very principled stand, talking about how do you account for what's happening in North Korea, because if the meeting is taking place in South Korea, that is an area where you have an issue of nuclear non-proliferation. You have a gentleman who's there in North Korea threatening people in the world with all kinds of missiles. So there it had a great amount of value when you raise issues like that, that you cannot accommodate somebody like Kim Jong-un or his country, or for that matter, how do you account for the long drawn negotiation that has taken place in sorting out the mess with Iran. So if you look at the statement that has come out of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, large part is taken up on North Korea as well as on the Iran process, and that is where a very few lines are actually devoted to, they don't name India, but basically about countries attempting to become part of the group, and they say that the discussion should go on. But I think they were able to play the game far better. And I think there is a certain kind of miscalculation. We should actually introspect. We should figure out whether we really got a few things the plot right. Did we know exactly what kind of support we were getting amongst the members of the Nuclear Suppliers Group? Where did we go wrong?
Okay.
Did we overreach? I mean, those are the issues that have to be asked.
Well, Commodore Bhaskar, do you really think on those lines?
You know, your first sort of question that you were raising about, did we misinterpret or did we overinterpret the kind of signals that came from China in the run-up, the week preceding the meeting in Seoul? I mean, I recall we've had some discussions on this, and when the Chinese made a statement saying that they have not closed the door and they are looking at other possibilities, there was a sense in India that perhaps China is coming around. and there was also a report that our Foreign Secretary Dr. Jaishankar had visited Beijing, and it seemed that the meeting in Tashkent would perhaps provide that political push. But I would reconstruct it slightly differently, and this is to add to the point made by Sanjay, that China, I think, was also giving itself a little diplomatic space, meaning that hypothetically, if this had gone the other way, that all the 47 countries barring China had indicated that they would support India's admission, then I would submit that China may not have been the only one standing in the way.
Okay.
They would have then perhaps grudgingly, they would not have been enthusiastic.
2008 it happened.
Yeah, that's when George Bush was able to prevail.
Muscle his way through.
This time around, I'm just saying that if the countries that we have identified from Brazil, Ireland, including Switzerland, had actually supported India, then I think China would have also perhaps recalibrated, and this was the kind of chess game that was going on in Tashkent. I mean, everybody was working the phones. There was the Chinese lobby, there was the Pakistan lobby, which is why countries like Switzerland decided that they would review their position, notwithstanding the commitment made when Prime Minister Modi had visited Switzerland. So I think what we are seeing is a very complex game. I use the word realpolitik. Some countries have done it for cynical reasons, and I still identify China because they have not acknowledged the whole issue of proliferation as a determinant.
Certainly.
The moment you introduce proliferation, and we have said this very often, even when the debate took place in 2008, I remember a very interesting session in the US Congress when repeatedly there was one lobby saying that if you can apply this for India, why not for Pakistan? Meaning, give Pakistan a similar status.
Right.
And Gary Ackerman, a congressman from New York at that time, stood up and said, sure, we'd be happy to give Pakistan a similar dispensation, but let them have a track record like India for 30 years.
True.
Meaning, let's revisit Pakistan's case in 2038. This is a 2008 debate.
Right.
I think that's a very valid metric. But look at the discourse in the debate in Seoul or in the run-up to the entire sort of NSG issue. Proliferation has been in a way excluded.
That's right.
Meaning what India's track record or Pakistan's lack thereof, Pakistan's culpability, I come back to A.Q. Khan. North Korea, China, and the whole linkage is something that is being deliberately ignored. So therefore we infer that, listen, when you talk about the nuclear business, it is not merit, it is not principle, it's hard power, it's realpolitik. And what is the objective? And that is where I think China has exuded a certain determination, which the other nuclear weapon powers, whether it is Moscow or Washington or Paris, all of them have a fairly important voice,
which is
have
why
chosen to stay quiet.
Is that the reason why we were focusing too much on China and not really looking at the others who could have been,
Well, I think we invested in Washington. After all, when Mr. Modi went to Washington, D.C. and met President Obama, there was some kind of a signaling. But let's be fair over there. I think the Americans were hinting even at that time, saying, try and reach out to China. Perhaps they had already come to an appreciation that it's not 2008, as Sanjay said. It was not possible for President Obama to pick up the phone and expect that President Xi Jinping would accommodate or comply with whatever was being said by Washington. So the grid has changed. But countries like Russia and Paris, because it's not so much about India, I think this is another issue we need to reflect on. There is a serious nuclear challenge. Today, the possibility that fissile material or a nuclear weapon, maybe of a tactical variant, can go to the wrong hands, the probability is increasing.
That's right.
And I come back to Pakistan. I mean, in Pakistan, we have a case where a warship was hijacked or an attempt was made by some personnel within the Pakistan Navy who, for ideological reasons, decided that they would act on their own. So we have a precedent.
So had China really, what is your reading? Had China pushed the Pakistan case again, and probably that is something which there won't be, the China won't find many takers within the NSG on that thought?
Well, I think the Chinese objective, if I could reconstruct it, is that in 2008, India managed to acquire an exceptional stand-alone status when 123 agreement was passed in Washington and the NSG gave the exceptional status. From 2009 onwards, I would submit that China was not comfortable with this particular profile of India, and successfully, with Pakistan's support, they have managed to put India back into the South Asian context of the nuclear issue, and the Indo-Pak hyphenation is back in the NSG. I don't think that's in India's interest, and we should again ensure that the global community is sensitized to the larger challenge.
We tried our level best diplomatically to reach out to China, to bring China on board. But where do you think, Mr. Kapoor, I mean, how do you think this is going to reflect upon our diplomacy, the way we had gone about the NSG's entry issue and other aspects? China has maintained,
I personally feel, I don't know whether Commander Bhaskar is going to agree with me, I think we overreached in a certain way. There was a lack of calibration. If you're going to invest our entire foreign policy to just this issue, then what you're trying to say that this or bust. This is not it is. I mean, we cannot trash a wide range of issues with which we are linked with China to become captive to NSG. And if there is a growing narrative that China is the enemy, they have done this wrong, then we are actually staring at a very hostile.
Both countries have maintained that the bilateral ties are not going to be affected.
But we have been able to manage it. I mean, there has been so much, and to the credit of Prime Minister Modi, he's worked hard since the time he's come in. He's had he's invited President Xi Jinping. They had such a wonderful meeting. There was a lot of reach out in terms of sorting out matters. Even just about a week, 10 days back, some of the niggling issues which were there about the Chinese businessmen coming in and their sailors getting greater access and staying over in India, all those things were being managed. But when you have a narrative funded and fueled by some US-based think tanks who are trying to bring about increase hostility between the two neighbors, I think this can really boomerang. It is a very dangerous situation. And if you look at the statements that were coming out even on the South China Sea, they made it very clear that they will fight if they are pushed by the United States of America. So we have to figure it out. I'm not saying that we should shy away if there is a fight, but do we want to get into it? Do we want to invest all our foreign policy energy in something that was probably not required? The fact is that we got an exceptional waiver on the nuclear suppliers group. We can participate in the regime to trade on all kinds of material. Then why did we need to go so far? And did we not? Don't you think there was a possibility to back off in between if it wasn't working? There was a need for a mid-course correction? Why did we go all out?
Commodore Bhaskar, was it also about America, because there is going to be a new leader now emerging in America post the elections? India could sense an opportunity for the NSG considering the backing that it got from the US. Perhaps that is why it was a very good moment, a good timing.
I'd like to offer again a slightly different interpretation of this from what Sanjay has just outlined. I would still say that India did what it felt was the appropriate initiative at that time, and we are talking about a few months ago, which is that this was the window for India to complete a process that began in July 2005 when the Civilian Nuclear Cooperation Agreement was mooted.
Right.
There are some, I would say, constituencies in India which now believe that, as Sanjay pointed out, that did we overinvest? Was the NSG worth the effort getting into it? I'm saying that when you're sitting in government, there is a case to be made that if you look at where we began in 2005 when India was the outsider, as far as the nuclear domain was concerned, progressively, with some very heavy lifting done by the Bush administration at that time, India got the exceptional status. So the next logical conclusion, and that is where I think you really square the circle in a holistic manner, is India's admission into the NSG as one more participating government that then gives you a voice in the equivalent of global governance when it comes to the nuclear issue. Now, is that a desirable objective? To me, the answer is yes. Now, what should you invest in it? What is the cost-benefit ratio? India had made it repeatedly clear that we are not making this a binary choice, saying that we would expect, as Prime Minister Modi said in Tashkent, that China should make a fair and objective assessment of the whole issue.
True.
It did not happen.
Yeah.
So now I think India should definitely review and carry out some kind of a postmortem about countries that had indicated that they would support, and Switzerland is a good example,
right,
but they chose to change their mind.
Right.
And I think this is a good point that Sanjay makes, that it's not just China. There are other countries in the world, in the NSG, which obviously have reservations. So India
what
has
has
to
also
engage
happened?
with them.
And the reservation is around the
what
NPT.
has really happened, the outcome which we need to discuss is that they made it very clear. I mean, I've been reading the statement, that they make the signing of NPT the cornerstone of getting into NSG. So we have to figure out whether, if we make the next attempt, would we be ready to sign the NPT?
NPT or not?
And
but that is a non-starter, because you can't sign the NPT having carried out your nuclear test in May 1998. You will not alter your status. India is not going to sign the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. So what I am saying is that there are some very real nuclear challenges. India has to review, based on the Seoul experience, how does it want to position itself, because these are real threats. At the moment they are challenges, they have the potential to become threats, and I think we need to contribute to the global nuclear narrative again and draw attention to some very serious challenges. I mean, I constantly say that the bandwidth is AQ Khan to Fukushima. How do you deal with this? And we also want a certain degree of nuclear restraint. The constant sort of saber rattling that Pakistan engages in, that we will use tactical nuclear weapons, seems to be endorsed by the global community. And when Russian President Putin says that I am going to position nuclear tipped missiles, all hell is let loose. So we do have varying standards.
But don't you think that this NPT issue is a very recurring issue? It's going to come up no matter how hard.
No, these countries have signed the NPT. I mean, I imagine a country, whether it is Brazil, Switzerland, whatever, they are going to raise the NPT. But that is where I think Indian diplomacy and the political leadership would have to convey what you might call as this very distinctive profile status of both India and Pakistan. What is being said about India is also applicable to Pakistan.
So that is where the problem lies.
So we have to find a way of accommodating.
What the problem lies is that the damn hyphenation is back. India, Pakistan are being spoken in the same breath, despite
and China underlines that.
Despite the boshed up track record of Pakistan, their criminality epitomized by AQ Khan, how he has been trading with all kinds of material.
So when is the next opportunity for India? I mean, November is the time.
So the process is there, but I think the government of India needs to figure out whether they really want to go ahead and do it. They are talking about the imperative of getting into NSG because of the Paris, the commitment that they made in Paris pertaining to the climate change, the deal that we have signed, and by 2030 we need to sign a few things and start getting when you made commitment about to bring down the temperature and all that, so you require to shift from one fuel regime to another.
That's right.
So that is the basis, that is a major reason that has been articulated. But I'm sure India needs to be in the high table to do many things.
Yeah.
And
peg the case accordingly. I mean,
and I think the opposition will grow. It's not going to come down. If it is 7 now, it may grow later.
Can India really, create this kind of thing, and can it really go ahead with this kind of a view on NPT, and the fact that, of course, what the other nations are doing when it comes to nuclear proliferation? Can India do that in a very little time, or do you think that it's going to take some time?
No, I would say that actually India has demonstrated a very distinctive kind of resilience as far as the nuclear issue is concerned, because if you look at India's track record and position, post 1974, when we carried out the peaceful nuclear explosion, which by the way was a response to what China did in October 1964, India has been able to stand its ground, meaning it's very ironic. While we have stayed outside of the NPT treaty formally, India remains committed to the spirit of non-proliferation.
That's right.
I mean, there is a whole history about Iraq under President Saddam Hussein at that time, trying to entice, encourage, cajole, prevail, quote unquote, short of threatening India, to support his program. But India did not. And this is something that all the professionals were aware of, and there was a good reason why India took that stand. So I think we have the ability, we have to recalibrate and in a way I would say rearrange the priorities that we will accord to the nuclear issue, because getting fuel for our civilian energy program is critical, especially in the light of the Paris commitment.
Fine. On that note, I'll wrap this discussion. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me here. That's all for today in Insight. Thanks very much for watching. Goodbye.